I was an undergraduate philosophy student at what is now called the University of Memphis. It was called Memphis State University back in that day. And I had a course from a professor by the name of Gene James in which we read a number of figures in the history of American philosophy. Whitehead was not one of them. But I went over to the library and I was reading along the shelves in the library, and the title Process and Reality caught my eye. And so I picked it up and I began reading, standing there in the library. I got pretty excited about what I was reading, and I went back and spoke to my professor about it, and he said, yes, that'll take you a long time to learn. But I knew from the moment that I picked up Process and Reality that I would be studying this seriously. How long did it take to learn it? Oh, I'm still learning it. And I have been studying Whitehead without any kind of break, seriously, for that entire time. I think that the way that I would define process philosophy now is really quite different from the way that I understood it to begin with. The thing that appealed to me most about process philosophy was that it took time seriously, and the passage of time in particular. And so for the first, say, 10 or 12 years that I was studying process philosophy, I was studying it as a philosophy of time. Gradually it began to dawn on me that the methodology was really thoroughly hypothetical, and it depended upon not talking about time except under certain kinds of restrictions that we place on it methodologically. And so once I realized that I wasn't speaking so much about time, I began to think about process philosophy not as a philosophy of time, but as a philosophy of methodologically neutralizing time in order to talk about all kinds of structural features of nature and of knowledge. What I would say to a student who wanted to know what process philosophy was, I would begin by asking the student, so, your experience, would you describe that as a process? The student will go, I never really thought, and if so, what kind of process? The trouble is that with process philosophy, you have to understand the whole in order to understand the parts, and you have to understand the parts in order to get a sense of the whole. And so it's very difficult to know where to begin with this question. And so beginning with the personal question, would you describe your experience as a process? Assuming I can get the answer yes, then I would say, so what other processes apart from your experience do you believe to be in the world? What else is real besides your experience? And then if I get a physics answer or a biology answer or a cultural answer to the idea of process beyond my own experience, if I get that from a student, then I'll build with whatever the student supplies. Everything is process, of course, and that's part of the difficulty of answering the question. As far as I know, there's not one single thing that we have any genuine experience of that isn't process. And therefore, since everything is process, nothing is process. It's not a very meaningful or informative term for that reason. And so one must begin somewhere and then build from there. But I would build the basic contrast between the process of one's own experience and the processes that one doesn't count as being one's own experience. The line is going to be an artificial one, and eventually it will be dissolved on further down in the conversation. But if I were dealing with a particularly mathematical undergraduate student, I would start with, so tell me about the whole of things. Now, what are the parts? And the reason is that I see process philosophy as a constant movement between an organic whole and the parts that make it the whole that it is and not some other. Eventually, the question of possibility has to be raised. In other words, here's an actual process that is my experience, here's an actual process that isn't my experience. To what whole do they belong? And taken as a whole, what was possible for them that never became actual at all? When those questions are answered, I think we have the student started in a course of thinking that it never finishes, but it does lead to deeper and deeper understanding of presupposed structure and which hypotheses should be put forward for which kinds of inquiries. There's a creative aspect to each and every, to the becoming of each and everything that's actual. And so creativity is not only an irreducible part of every act in the cosmos, it is also non-deducible from the entire past, and given, even if you had perfect understanding of everything in the present, you wouldn't understand the precise combination of valuation that leads to the achievement of any individual actual entity. And so anything that's actual in the world, no matter how loosely associated its actuality is, it's going to be swimming with creativity that's neither predictable, nor is it fully analyzable or understandable after it has occurred. Therefore, there's art and adventure and beauty in everything, insofar as the cosmos, as a flux, as a process, as a transition and concrescence that's underway, is itself going to be the ground of any art or anything that we call beautiful. Art, specifically, as a cultural form, has to do with capturing something dynamic in some medium. And of course, the media can be mixed as well. For Whitehead, there's no question that the art that spoke to him the most was poetry. And that in seeking for examples of beauty, he was always reaching for Wordsworth or Tennyson. Those were his favorite poets. And for the way that language can concretize, and even being repeated can reconcretize in a newly creative way. There's nothing quite like listening to a good reader read poetry, and all of a sudden you hear what was in the words all along come to life in a way that you never considered before. The same thing would apply to any other kind of art. And so the visual arts, that was not Whitehead's main way of appropriating the forms of art and culture. He almost always thought of it in terms of the language arts and the way that language is used beautifully, and those were his examples. I can hardly think of a single example that he pulled from painting. From sculpture, once in a while, he will speak of this kind of art. It's not that he didn't appreciate it, but I do think that there is a very great difference between the kind of thinker who, when the word art is spoken, pulls down in his or her imagination a painting or a sculpture or a work of architecture, and the kind of thinker who will immediately begin to recite poetry to you. Whitehead was that second kind. And I do think it affected how he understood art. I think that he thought that that poetry, Kant also said that poetry is the highest of the arts, and I have a feeling that Whitehead and Kant were very similar in temperament with regard to this kind of art as a cultural form. But the whole reason that art is important as a cultural form has to do with its intensification of experiences that we have ordinarily all the time. And so art as a cultural form is an intensification of that which is going on in the process and the cosmos constantly. I don't think Whitehead himself was very artistic. He was an athlete. And I do think that there is art in athletics. And I think that when Whitehead thought personally about what he could create, he didn't see his own language as being nearly as poetic as people after him have said. He was a beautiful writer, but he did not write in order to write beautifully. This was not his way of going about the world. I think that he was an appreciator of art more than a creator of it. However, in terms of the performance or process of performance, which is not something that I think Whitehead gave a great deal of thought to, but he had a student, Suzanne Langer, who did give a great deal of thought to this. And her two main works in aesthetics, one is called Philosophy in a New Key, which she dedicated to Whitehead, and the other one is called Feeling and Form, which she dedicated to Ernst Cassirer, whom she also regarded as her teacher. She goes about as far into, as a process philosopher, she goes about as far into the process of creating art. Her entire aesthetics is an aesthetics of creating art. I take it to be more or less continuous with Whitehead's philosophy, and that's the way I teach it. So if you want Whiteheadian aesthetics as a philosophy of art, I mean, in a sense, Whitehead's entire philosophy is aesthetics because it's a theory of feeling. The entire, the most basic unit of the concretization of a cosmology in process and reality is called apprehension, which is a feeling of feeling. That's the way Hartshorne described it anyway. I'm not sure that Whitehead ever quite used that phrase, but it's consistent with what he said. And so there's a feeling of feeling. And from this, the cosmos is built. Something feels something else. Charles Peirce had a very similar view of the cosmos as feeling. And so the whole philosophy is in aesthetics, but as a philosophy of art, of the creative process of the human beings, as they not only feel, but as they work with those feelings in order to solidify, concretize, and intensify them, and then present them to other people so that they can be commonly shared. That process does have, there's a private moment in that process, which is certainly difficult to put in, if not impossible, to put into words. On the other hand, this is a peculiar interest of mine because I became convinced a long time ago. The reason I got into philosophy was because of music. I'm a bass player, and when I improvised, I found myself doing things that I had never imagined, had never anticipated, that they make sense, and they make bodily sense in the sense that you can you can be playing along and you understand how your body did what it did, but you don't have time to think about what you're doing. You're simply doing it. There's a pure doing, and it actually isn't private. Because there is no effort to conceive the artwork, the improvised piece of music. There's no effort to think about it before actually creating it, and yet it has tremendous intelligibility as created. It was that experience of playing the bass that led me into philosophy to try to understand what happens. Creating a work of art by thinking of it ahead of time and then seeing what it's like to create it, this is the more familiar pattern. But creating it through pure improvisation, using one's own body as an instrument, and there's a form of generalized awareness which is precognitive, but it is fully intelligible, that's involved in improvising music. I believe it can be done, and in fact is done, by people who are painting and by people who are sculpting and by people who are automatically writing poetry. And I became convinced pretty early on that the key to getting this into a philosophy was to interview songwriters, because they in the initial instance they improvise the song. They don't know exactly what it's going to be until it begins to take form, and part of that comes from they don't know where. I've interviewed hundreds of songwriters about this question. They don't know exactly where the words come from. They don't know exactly where the music comes from, but they have to improvise it first, and then it will take form. Then it will come into a concretized whole that makes a certain amount of sense. All of them believe in inspiration, but they don't know what that means, and neither do I. I mean, I write songs as well, and sometimes they come all at once, and sometimes they come very slowly. But I believe that it's the same thing with painting and with sculpting. There is an improvisational element in every creation of a work of art, and that improvisational element is not private. It is ineffable, but it's not private, because it doesn't exist ahead of time in one's thoughts or private experience. It comes out as one is making it. And so ineffable, yes; private, no. Nevertheless, having made it, having created a work of art, somebody asks you, how did you do that? Well, I don't know. I can't share that with you. I can say, look, you see what it is. You tell me how I did it. I don't know how I did it. So. Whitehead's philosophy of organism, that somehow the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but that the parts each contribute some unique energy or vibration to the whole, is very much the kind of philosophy that we could draw on in order to understand heavily entropic systems like sonic waves. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness in Whitehead's philosophy is his way of parsing what William James called the philosopher's fallacy. And in fact, a number of other people, including Kant, had articulated this kind of mistake any number of times before. Basically, what the fallacy is it means that you take an idea that you've got in your mind, which is already an abstraction of some kind, and you use it to explain things that are far more complicated that are actually going on in the world, but you take the idea or the concept to be concrete while the world is abstract. And so it's a reversal of the order of experience, so that our experience becomes an abstraction and our concepts become their explanation. This is exactly backwards. Our experience is the basis of everything, and of everything we know and of everything we can explain. And there is experience that's not ours as well. We have ample evidence that there is. And so experience itself and its relation to existence in the sense of what's actual and what's possible. A lot of possibilities exist even though they'll never become actual. And this comparison and contrast of actual experience with possibility, this is concrete. Even possibilities that never happen are more concrete than even our simplest and most concrete idea. Our ideas are rarifications of experience that have been reduced and reduced and reduced to such a determinate, and that concepts become like a hard little shell that you can't get inside of once you have conceived of it. And it becomes like a stone that you can throw at anything you don't understand. And so I throw my concept stone at God, and even if it should strike dead center, it doesn't explain God. And so the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is it's a caution, it's a warning saying, don't fall in love with your own concept and don't use them as a rock to hurl at phenomena and experience that are much richer and much more difficult to understand than the concept itself. It's the flux, but it's a variable flux. And when the variable flux overlaps in, say, the way, just to give one example, in the way that the difference between the speed of light and the speed of sound being very dense and difficult to propagate, requiring a very specific kind of medium, sound waves are highly entropic. Whereas light, very easy to propagate, the medium doesn't make as much difference. Yet, light and sound overlap, and you hear what I'm saying as you see it. There is something about the way that the variable flux overlaps that creates more and less stable things that we call spaces. All spaces are temporary and depend upon the variable overlapping of multiple aspects of the flux. So time is a very vague word that we use in order to talk about the most regular forms of and predictable forms of overlapping in the flux. For Whitehead, past, present, and future could be thought of in two very different ways. The first, he uses the language of events to speak of it. And as events, there are overlapping, nested hierarchies of duration that would be very much like the overlapping in the flux itself. But the difference is an event has a certain coherence to it that mere overlap in the flux wouldn't necessarily have. Something comes together, and that something that is made always shall have been made and contributes itself to every possible future. That's the language of events. However, there's a sense in which, in order to analyze an event, one must subject it to some kind of a coordination and some kind of a genetic specification. And so we don't use the language of events here, we use the language of formative elements or fundamental forms that we appeal to as descriptive tools in order to to perform an analysis on that flux of events and their overlapping hierarchies of duration. So the genetic and coordinate method that he uses in order to analyze, it's a kind of mereotopology of events. One hypothesizes a single event and then constructs the world around that. It first is set out as a coordinate whole, and then the coordinates are genetically specified according to the purposes of an inquiry. And so in that sense, past becomes whatever endures in the analysis, and present is whatever our primary point of interest is in the analysis. And then the future becomes the destiny of whatever it is that we are interested in for the sake of that analysis. If you change the purpose of your inquiry, then past, present, and future in this descriptive sense will also be heavily altered. Cosmology is very different from evolutionary theory. For example, the kinds of inquiries that are involved are very different from one another, and they require a hypothesized coordinate whole that's really quite different as well. Yes, process philosophy and pragmatism. Pragmatism is generally thought of as a philosophical movement that originated in the United States in the 19th century, late 19th century, and has subsequently spread in lots of other places. There are a number of unfortunate historical associations, for example, that Theodore Roosevelt was president as pragmatism became known as an American school of philosophy, so that to much of the world, Theodore Roosevelt became their picture of what a pragmatist was, which meant to everyone outside of the United States American opportunism and colonial ambition and bellicosity and all of the things that Theodore Roosevelt stood for. He was, from the standpoint of a reformer, a very important president. From the standpoint of a diplomat, he was terrible. And so as Americans spread out through the world with the word pragmatism on their lips, everyone heard whatever Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy was and saw the American philosophers saying these things as so many apologists for a new American adventurism in the world as it attempted to take over not only militarily whatever it could get its hands on, but also intellectually whatever it could justify. Unfortunately, that's the history of the word pragmatism. However, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the philosophy, which is not a peculiarly American philosophy. It's a way of looking at particularly John Stuart Mill's advances on the limits of empirical reasoning and applying that not just to the study of nature, so Mill's inductive logic, but to philosophy itself, and to try to make philosophy fallibilist, to try to make it an estimate of what's possible for human beings on the basis of what's actual for them. And so for this reason, pragmatism applies to any human beings anywhere who want to be careful about not misusing abstractions in order to make more of their favorite ideas than those ideas warrant. With that said, is there a relationship between process philosophy and pragmatism? Process philosophy, as the fundamental study of the flux and of change and of all of the variable modalities in which it can be, that change and flux can be understood, clearly pragmatism and process philosophy have a complementarity. I would say that every good pragmatist is a kind of process philosopher, but not every process philosopher is a pragmatist. I don't read Alfred North Whitehead as being a pragmatist at all. He simply has sympathies with people like William James, who is. Henri Bergson is not a pragmatist, but he is a process philosopher. There are ways to do process philosophy that are driven more by logic and science than they are by convictions about the limits of philosophy. However, I would say that good process philosophers have to be fallibilists. I think they have to be radical empiricists. And so for this reason, they all have a certain debt to people like William James for framing a very concrete and viable set of limitations on what indulgences philosophers allow themselves if they want to remain relevant and if they want to talk about what's actual in the world. I would say that Whitehead's approach to religion appeals to people of a philosophic temper who have also aesthetic, are aesthetically as opposed to conceptually or ethically driven, which is to say those who are philosophical but They're philosophical because they feel philosophical, not just because they find themselves in possession of the conceptual tools that enable them to do philosophy well. So I think that Whitehead, as therapeia for a certain kind of intellectual, a philosophical kind of intellectual who has religious feelings, as therapy for that kind of person, Whitehead is unmatched. And the beauty of his language is the kind of thing that communicates, because it isn't always just the language, it's also the way he sees the concepts with such feeling. Also, his ability to express the appropriate horror at the history of religious misdoing is important. So there is a kind of person, I would say, in contrast. There are two kinds of sort of religious intellectuals of feeling. There's the C.S. Lewis kind, and then there's the Alfred North Whitehead kind. And the interesting thing is they never like one another, because the C.S. Lewis kind, their form of feeling is ethical in character, whereas the Whitehead kind, it's aesthetic in character. And so if I'm not saying that the Lewis people don't love art, and I'm not saying that the Whitehead people are not ethical, but what I am saying is that the form that feeling takes, it's never guilt in Whitehead, and it always is in C.S. Lewis. It's what ought I to be doing that I'm not doing? How could I serve humanity or God or even myself better? That's the ethical question that the kind of people who like C.S. Lewis will ask. This doesn't occur to Whitehead. It's much more private, and it doesn't necessarily lead to action in the world. It's a meditative approach to understanding the religious meaning of our lives. I think there is a big difference between Whitehead's God and the God of religion. And Richard Ely wrote a very nice piece shortly after Whitehead's death called The Religious Availability of Whitehead's God, in which he argued, and I agree with him, that Whitehead's God is really not like the God that we inherit in the Western tradition, nor is this exactly pantheism. Whitehead's God has a very definite creative role in giving purpose and meaning to an unfolding process, whether that process is the cosmos or of biological life or of the creation of a single work of art. The divine might be a better way to talk about it. The divine is there in all of this. God is a word that is highly charged in our culture. Whitehead chose to use it, and quite purposely chose to use it. However, it has led to an awful lot of discussion among people who are the inheritors of Whitehead's thought and of his work as to whether or not we really ought to use this word to describe what he was talking about. However, the God of the philosophers has always been similar to what Whitehead is talking about in God, and bringing together the God of the philosophers with the God of religion has always been a very delicate task. I think it's a valuable task to compare and to ask questions about the God of the philosophers in comparison with the God of theologians, and to take those two together and ask whether this has anything to do with what the ordinary world means when it uses the word God, and what the ordinary world beyond this rarefied atmosphere that matters so little, what the word God is as an operative term in culture. I think that's a really valuable task. I think it's an infinite task. I don't think the philosophers are likely to give up their conception of the whole, which is what they mean by God. And I don't think the theologians are likely to give up their ideas and concepts of God, especially as related to various historical religions, but also as criticizing various historical religions. That's not going to happen, nor is the idea and the word God going to go away from our culture. And so, infinite task, yes. Valuable task, necessary task, I think so. In many ways, I've written several papers in which I criticize both philosophers and theologians for having abdicated open public discussion of the most important question in our contemporary day, which is, what is God? We're fighting wars over it now, as we have been pretty much for the last 2,500 years, since the Greek ideas about God met the Hebrew ideas about God, and all of a sudden there was an uncomfortable meeting of the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham. And from that point forward, the Western world has had an extremely difficult time coming to terms with the meaning of this word. And so it must be done, and philosophers and theologians must do it. This conversation should be guided by and carried out, guided by philosophers and theologians, and carried out in public. And we cannot just talk to one another. We have to talk to the world about this. Whether anyone will listen, I don't know, but I also know we haven't really tried. If the question is whether music is peculiar in its capacity to awaken in human beings certain kinds of philosophical insights that really can't be gotten anywhere else, I would say I think that is true. However, aesthetic experience and the experience of being creative will awaken analogous experiences that are equally valuable. I do think that there are genuinely non-musical souls, genuinely non-musical people who get their understanding of human creativity through other forms. It is very difficult for someone like me whose entire being is musical, and I grew up in a house, both of my parents are musicians, and performing musicians at that. I was never in a situation where people weren't playing music growing up, and have never been in one in my adult life either. And so since I am so completely saturated in the musical way of being in the world, it's difficult for me to imagine what non-musical people do in order to understand their world, because mine comes from music. Everything I do in philosophy is motivated by my understanding of the experience of music. The reason I became a process philosopher is because of the way music moves in time. And it posed a problem to me that wasn't being well answered by the other philosophies that I read, but the process philosophers had some things to say about jazz in particular and the way jazz moves improvisationally. For this reason, I think music probably is responsible for the way I philosophize. Whether it's the best way to philosophize, I would never necessarily say that, but I would say that taking change into account however it occurs, and particularly the creative aspects of change, how it is that novelty comes into the world, that configurations of the flux that have never happened before somehow happen in ways that then can be built on. These kinds of questions are posed in a very basic way by music, and they can be posed by other forms of human experiencing. But to me, music, it seems to get to the root of the way that time and change and creativity come together to form something intelligible. And the first thing that's intelligible to us is the way it feels. The way it feels to do it and the way it feels to hear it, the way it feels to create the music, and the inner and outer dialectic that sets up. Your body hears what your body's doing just a microsecond later than the doing of it, and it creates a temporal separation in which you become aware of what's possible for you to do, but having done it, what's actually going to come back has to do with the way that the world works with what you've done. I actually think there's an awakening of consciousness there that makes a huge difference to the history of civilization. Did music make us human? No. Did it make us culturally what we are? Yes, it did. It's all relations. The symphony is relations, intelligible relations that are swirling around the room. It's not just what's written on the paper, but not without it, right? It's not just what's coming out of the instruments, but not without that. It's not what's going on inside the musicians, but not without that. It's not what's happening as the audience hears, but not without that. It's not what's happening to the audience as a result of the feeling of what is being heard, but not without that. It's not just the acoustics of the hall or of the open sky, but not without that. as I mentioned earlier, sound is very, very difficult to propagate as a medium, but it's really, really rich. Highly entropic forms of waves can be saturated with level after level after level of intensity and potential communicability. And so a good Liszt symphony, you know, I was thinking of like Preludes, is that I heard that performed once. It's the best single performance I have ever attended. And where's the symphony? It was everywhere for everyone who was there, and it still is. It's still here. I just brought it back into the present in this moment. Just felt it again, right? And so that symphony is still going on. I have a feeling Liszt would like that because he had a really huge ego. So. Well, I take Whitehead to have done that. I think. I mean, the vibratory aspects of his cosmological descriptions cover the varieties of the ways that the flux can overlap in order to create, however unstable or however stable, a set of relations that we call presentational spaces. What exists when a symphony is being performed is a temporary presentational space that's impossible to sustain for very long because of the entropic character of sound. But it is sustainable long enough for all of the pieces to interweave with one another, because what happens is our bodies become little music preservers. If music is performed well and in such a way that the psychoacoustics fall together in just the right way, I'm still hearing the first note when I hear the last note echo away. It's all still there in the sense that my body has become a little music preserving machine, but it's not a machine. I mean, it's a music absorber. So in the same way that a rock heats up when you set it near a fire, if you put a human body in the presence of a symphony, you've got something that's going to heat up in its own acoustic way. And assuming that the body has been, I mean, some rocks get hot faster than others, and others get hot slowly but stay hot for a longer time. You set different human bodies into the symphony hall, and you're going to have the same sort of variety. There's a body that already knows sort of how to preserve just those relations in the music that make it meaningful, to recognize a motif, to recognize something that something as it comes up later in a varied form that sets off an echo of something that happened earlier. There are people who sit in the symphony hall and they hear all of that, and they'll be preserving what you might call the most rarefied and saturated at the same time relations that were made available. There are other people who just say, I like music, and they're taking it as a whole. And those people's experience of the symphony can, in its own way, that's a rock that heats up very, very slowly. It can be every bit as intense and every bit as deep, but it's really quite different from the music aficionado who has listened to the symphony 75 times before coming for the performance in order to look for just those relations and to see how they will do this. They're sitting in the same symphony hall. One is a rock that heats up quickly, but the other is one that heats up slowly but nevertheless burns and glows for a very long time thereafter. And so that kind of experience, call it psychoacoustics if you like, but as you can see, there's a physical aspect of it that's more than acoustics. It has more to do not just with the way sonic spaces interact, but physics itself as a whole is involved in this. Some people's bodies are not sensitive, their ears aren't good, but other people might have more sensitive non-aural sensation and be able to feel the music in completely different ways that a person with a good ear wouldn't even necessarily understand. I had taken to philosophy more as a form of almost dialectic or debate. I enjoyed throwing ideas around. I had not found anything that began to produce any kinds of conviction in me about, a direction, a methodology, ways of thinking about problems that I thought were superior to other ways of thinking about problems. And so for that reason, when I started to read Whitehead, in particular Whitehead. I identify myself as a Whiteheadian. I don't say this about any other philosopher. I'm not a Deweyan, I'm not a Jamesian, I'm not a Roycean, but I do call myself a Whiteheadian philosopher. This was, the philosophy was alive. It moved. It spoke deeply to my own experience, but it's not just that. It seemed to me that once I began to study Whitehead, that I was going to set aside all the dialectic and use it only as a tool of discussion, whereas the tool of inquiry for me now became Whiteheadian methodologies. I think that classical philosophy and the various movements in Western philosophy from the time of Plato up through the 20th century are important and should be studied, but they are over, and they have been over for quite some time. It's just that the world of especially professional philosophers has not gotten the news. Philosophy began to change in the 19th century as the work of Kant was better and better understood, and in particular by people like Charles Peirce, who were beginning to embrace the idea that change is going to be a fundamental and irreducible aspect of any kind of explanation, philosophical explanation we provide. From the point of view of an active subject determining his or her world, and this is the Kantian turn, we end up with a completely new set of philosophical tools to explain why we think as we do and what our lives mean. Increasingly, since Kant, classical frameworks, substance metaphysics, and all of the questions that we inherited from the Greeks and from the Greek encounter with the Hebrew world, all of those questions have begun to turn loose, to lose their grip on our culture and on our philosophers. It is a very gradual process. Philosophy does not change quickly. Process philosophy in 200 years will be the only active and meaningful kind of philosophy, because the process philosophers got it right. Change is the place where we start. It's not the thing that we explain away. It's not the thing that we create some kind of an abstract or artificial framework in order to make ourselves feel more comfortable about our destiny and our fate. Rather, change is where we start, and explanation is where we go as we consider what's possible in contrast to what's actual. And that's what process philosophy does, and it does it quite well and increasingly well as time goes on. And so, old-style language analysis will be gone very soon. It's almost gone already. The philosophy of science, in terms of the arguments over things like observation terms and the sort of classical historical arguments that were had over Thomas Kuhn's theories, these things are going away and being replaced by a much more dynamic, much more empirical, much more interesting and satisfying way of philosophizing that goes under the general term process philosophy. 200 years, nobody will be doing anything else.